This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules that comprise the first of two lectures covering the material in our Chapter 5. That is the material on inferences and human inferenceabilities. Now we'll talk about human inferenceabilities generally, but this chapter will focus much more on the human intuitive capacity to formulate and evaluate deductive inferences. We're going to start this lecture just with the introduction of a characterization of inferences that will serve as a framework for the rest of our term and throughout the chapter and the textbook as a whole. Once we have that characterization of inferences as psychological processes that transform information, we'll then turn our attention to two elements that strongly, maybe even disproportionately, influence native human inference and decision-making abilities. We'll look at the brain's architecture, specifically focusing on the structure and limitations of human working memory. Then we'll turn our attention to the 4.4 to 7 million years of human and proto-human evolution and talk about how that has influenced our native inference and decision-making strategies. After that, we'll turn our attention to the general categories of inference strategies that cognitive scientists have developed to describe and predict human inference and decision-making behaviors, as well as talk about the typical deployment of these different kinds of categories in everyday, ordinary inference and decision-making situations. We'll end this first lecture by focusing in on one of those categories, the first of the categories, that is, general heuristics. We'll talk about what general heuristics are, their relationship to other inference strategies, and then we'll talk about how these general heuristics facilitate human inference and decision-making abilities, how they can sometimes introduce inabilities, and importantly, how they introduce biases in the way that human beings make inferences and decisions when they employ these general heuristics. So let's go to that first bullet point and focus in now on characterizing inferences. We're going to start by asking and answering a simple basic question. What are inferences? And our answer is going to be that inferences are transformations of information, psychological processes that transform information. Then I'm going to argue and suggest that inferences are so pervasive in our everyday lives that there isn't a conscious moment where we're not, at some level, consciously, unconsciously, semi-consciously making inferences. Given how pervasive and foundational our capacity to make inferences is in human cognition, we'll want to think about what some of the functions of inferences are that make them so invaluable and integral to human cognition. Then we're going to want to think about the sorts of goals or properties that if we were designing inference strategies, designing decision strategies, we might want to try and optimize. We'll conclude our discussion of how to characterize inferences by distinguishing between two classes of inferences, deductive inferences and inductive inferences. And what we'll see is that we can distinguish these major kinds of inferences, these fundamental differences in inferences, in terms of the relationships between the initial information and the information that results from that informational transformation. And specifically, we'll see that these two different inference strategies have a different relationship precisely because they emphasize or optimize different goals in the inferential process. Let's go ahead and ask and answer that first question. What are inferences? The characterization of inferences that is going to be operant throughout the course and throughout the textbook is the notion of inferences as psychological processes, the purpose or goal of which is to transform information. So inferences are psychological processes that take information that's available and explicit to that process And then through that information transformation, they generate newly available and explicit information for the purposes of adaptive behavioral responses, or as input for a second process, or as information that can then be stored in long-term memory. Now, we'll also distinguish, as we'll see, between two different kinds of transformations. Transformations that go beyond what's guaranteed to be true, that give us information that is otherwise unavailable given the truth of what we know, and we'll call those inductive inferences, and inferences that take information that has to be true given what we know, but isn't explicitly revealed to us, isn't encoded for us explicitly, and then make that information explicit. And we'll call those inferences deductive inferences. So we want to make sure that we understand this definition. And in particular, we want to make sure we get at the idea of available and explicit information. So in the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention specifically to talking about that and to talking about inferences generally.